Here's Rene Descartes. Smart guy, French guy, wrote a lot of stuff. You probably remember reading On Discourse of Reason and reading where he wrote Cogito ergo sum. Well, probably not because he wrote it in French, but whatever. I got thinking about this, and that's a little anthropocentric as a biology teacher. Um, there are plenty of things that probably aren't doing a whole lot of thinking that still are. But since all organisms are going to engage in excretion, getting rid of metabolic wastes, a better way to frame this would be excreto ergo sum. Now, when we start thinking about excretion, a lot of people start thinking about tinkle, and that's something to think about. It is excretory. But we also have to remember that sweat is excretion, and every time you blow the candles out on the birthday cake, you're excreting all over the birthday cake for everybody. So I like to go with I excrete, therefore I am. Howdy, folks. Thanks for checking into Mr. Ulrich's Land of Biology. I am Mr. Ulrich, and yes, in this video, we're going to be talking about the excretory system. And a good place to start with each organ system are the life processes involved. This one isn't so hard. It's excretion. Plus, I already talked about it. As I said, that is the removal of metabolic waste. And this term metabolic is going to be kind of important. It brings up the life process known as metabolism, which includes all of those chemical reactions, being the building up or the breaking down or just the changing chemical reactions that are going on within the body. So this means that the wastes that are excreted have to have at one time or other been part of us. As an organism utilizes those macro and micronutrients that it's been taking in, changing them through metabolism, it's going to end up with some parts that don't get used and need to be excreted. And some of those parts are going to be rather gnarly, kind of toxic, and so they really have to be gotten rid of. So we should take a second here to just review those macronutrients that we talked about back in biochemistry and what they get used for and what some of those compounds are that we got to get rid of. Carbohydrates, remember, are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, with hydrogen and oxygen in the same ratio as water, so twice as many hydrogens as oxygen. One of the big uses of carbohydrates is going to be the fuel for cellular respiration. So through that, we're going to end up with ATP, which we need, but as a waste product, we end up developing carbon dioxide and water as well as heat, and that stuff needs to be excreted. It needs to be gotten rid of. We're going to take some of the carbohydrates and store them up in the form of glycogen, and sometimes we can actually take those sugars and turn them into fats as well if there are plenty of sugars around. Since we can make lipids out of carbohydrates, they're going to be made out of the same elements, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. One of the jobs then of lipids is to be a long-term energy store. But we can also use them to make compounds like hormones, and phospholipids make up the lipid bilayer of every cell in your body, so pretty important. We can use them as fuel molecules, but they have to be converted back into carbohydrates in order to be used. And when that happens, because it's a different ratio of hydrogens to oxygens, we end up making compounds called ketones that need to be excreted. When it comes to protein metabolism, we get a little extra added bonus because not only are we dealing with carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, but we get the added element of nitrogen. Yes, I know there's sulfur and some other compounds as well, but when it comes to needing to excrete materials, the nitrogen becomes kind of an issue. Go back to what proteins are used for. Remember, super important. They make up all those enzymes and the hormones and the chaperones and the transport proteins on the surface of the cell membrane and all kinds of stuff. So super important. They also make up contractile filaments, right, of actin and myosin. So your muscles use the protein filaments in order to move things around. Of course, in doing so, they're going to use up some ATP and they're going to generate some heat and some carbon dioxide and maybe some lactic acid and a whole bunch of other stuff. So a bunch of stuff has to be excreted when that goes on. But we can also use proteins to build other compounds. We can use proteins as a fuel source. The problem is they have to be converted into carbohydrates. We can also convert them into lipids, but they have to be converted into lipids and carbohydrates with the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And the question you should be asking yourself, what about all that nitrogen? This means that when we take compounds that are made out of chan and convert them into compounds made of cho, we're going to have some N left over, and that nitrogen is going to be excreted as nitrogenous wastes. So in order to get that N off of the chan, off of the amino acid, we're just going to take the whole amine group off. Remember, each amino acid is made of an amine group and a carboxyl group and a central carbon that's attached to a functional group. So we're just going to pull that whole amine group off in a process known as deamination. Now, due to the nature of the chemistry of amino acids, when we pull that amine group off, it's going to form ammonia. Or NH3. Ammonia is excruciatingly toxic, and so we can't let that sit around in cells or in organisms for very long, and it needs to be excreted. Different organisms have different adaptations in order to deal with getting rid of their nitrogenous wastes. Now, the problem with ammonia, again, is it's very toxic, and in order to effectively excrete it, it's going to need to be dissolved in water. Now, if you're a fish, you're floating around in your own kind of septic broth anyway. And so just as the proteins are deaminated and ammonia is made, it can be excreted right from the blood directly into their environment. Dilution is a solution to pollution. Away the offending ammonia goes. Now, if you're a terrestrial organism, however, we got a different problem. We're not going to be able to excrete the ammonia as a gas. And so if you're something like a bird or a reptile or an insect, instead of excreting the ammonia in liquid form as a solution, the nitrogenous wastes are converted into a solid called uric acid, which is not very toxic, and they can carry that around and not be carrying around a whole bunch of weight, right? Water weight. Now, mammals have adapted a different pathway. We still carry around a bag of water to carry our nitrogenous wastes in. But instead of carrying around nitrogenous waste in the form of ammonia, which would be rather toxic, we convert the ammonia into urea, which is still water soluble. And then periodically, we can empty out our water bag and the nitrogenous wastes that are in it. If we're going to talk about deamination, we have to talk about the fabulous, fabulous liver. Pretty important organ. I've known it's been important for a long time. The Greek myth of Prometheus involves Prometheus kind of ticking Zeus off, and so Zeus chained him to a rock and then sent an eagle every day to consume Prometheus's liver. But since Prometheus couldn't die, was immortal, his liver would grow back, and then the next day the eagle would come and consume it again. So pretty important stuff. Now, when it comes to excretory function, the liver gets a little bit tough to describe because it is not necessarily a filter. We often talk about blood being filtered by the liver, but it's really not because there's no out from the liver. What actually happens is this is where compounds are processed. So as macromolecules pass through the liver, there are enzymes that can change those materials. If you remember, when an individual consumes something like ethyl alcohol, all of the blood that comes from the small intestines where that material is absorbed, stuff like ethyl alcohol, is going to go through the liver first. That way the liver can process the alcohol or other medications or other compounds that are being consumed before it's circulated throughout the body. Clearly, the liver can't be functioning as an excretory organ on its own. It needs to be kind of connected to some other organs where the material will actually leave the body. So I'm going to introduce those other organs. I'll give you the organ and then its excretory product, and then which compounds are excreted via that excretory product. Again, since the liver doesn't make an excretory product, it's really just changing the blood as the blood goes through the liver. It's going to need some other organs to work with. One of those organs is the skin, biggest organ of the body. As the changed blood goes through the sweat glands, from the blood, stuff like water and nitrogenous waste in the form of urea and salt and some other surplus stuff is kind of packaged together into sweat. Now, as the sweat evaporates, it's going to get rid of another excretory product of heat. It's not a stuff again. I know we talked about this. It's not a stuff, but it's still something that needs to be excreted. Now, the lungs, we talked about in the respiratory system. We have to remember, just because an organ is in one system, it's not going to be in any other organ systems like the liver. The lungs are going to be excreting the carbon dioxide and water that are produced in our cells through cellular respiration. So the lungs produce breath, and that gets rid of CO2 and water. The other organs that are involved here make up what's called the urinary system: the kidneys, the ureter, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. Their job, they kind of work together in order to make urine. Within the urine is stuff like water and urea and salts and surplus stuff. And if this sounds, hey, a lot like sweat, it's because sweat and urine are chemically very similar. Remember that the next time you are working out in the gym and you get up from the bench, wipe the sweat off the bench for the next person so they don't have to lay in it. You'll notice that I have not talked about poop-poop-a-doop. I haven't talked about pooping. All right, feces are not actually truly an excretory product. Remember, you are a donut, so when you eat something, something passes through the whole of you, the donut, and isn't actually in you until it gets inside of the donut itself. And so most of the material that's in poop is material that was never part of you, and it's therefore, we call it egestion instead of excretion. So feces, not really excretory. There are some excretory products in there, but not much. Let's take a quick moment to look at the anatomy of the urinary system. We'll start up here with the adrenal gland sitting up on top of the kidney. Now, the adrenal gland is actually not part of the urinary or excretory system. It's part of the endocrine system. So we'll talk about that later on. The reason why I have it in here is because the term adrenal is going to introduce this idea of the word renal meaning kidney. So adrenal really means adjacent to the kidney. The kidneys are where urine is actually divined from the blood. So urine is actually produced in the kidneys. As it is produced, it travels down the ureter, makes it to the urinary bladder, where it's stored for a period of time before it is passed out of the body periodically via the urethra. The kidney then is the business section of the urinary system, as this is where tinkle is divined from the blood. Kidney beans look a lot like kidneys, hence their name, kidney beans. So blood is going to go into the kidney, and part of the blood comes out actually within the kidney and is going to collect in this region down here called the renal pelvis. And then it is directed down the ureter to the urinary bladder. Within each kidney are millions of these tiny structures called nephrons. And the nephrons are the microscopic functional units of the kidney, just like the alveolus is the functional unit of the lung. And just like at the alveolus, we have waste products diffusing out of the blood into a excretory product, in this case breath. At the nephron, same kind of thing is going to happen. We're going to have waste material allowed to diffuse out of the blood, right, and collect as urine to be eliminated from the body, right? But that's an overgeneralization when it comes to the function of the nephron. It's kind of like if you've ever been at the pool and you got a couple kids who are horsing around, right? The lifeguard is going to blow the whistle and have everybody leave the pool. Right, whether they're misbehaving or not, right? Everybody out of the pool. And then the kids who weren't misbehaving, the good kids, are allowed to go back into the pool. And the bad kids aren't allowed to go back into the pool. And that's a lot closer to how tinkle is divined from blood, as I like to say. So the first thing that happens up here in the glomerulus is filtration, right? Dissolved material is allowed to leave the blood, whether it's a waste product or a nutrient, helpful, good, bad, indifferent, doesn't matter. Stuff that can dissolve out of the blood dissolves out of the blood. It says here all of it. That's an overgeneralization. All of it doesn't leave. Some of it stays behind. Now, we got to let the good kids back into the pool, right? And so now that we've taken all of the stuff, good, bad, and indifferent, we got to let the good stuff back in. So the next step is this process known as reabsorption. This is where some active transport is going to come in because not all the stuff is going to want to diffuse back into the blood. We're going to actively transport it against the concentration gradient back into the blood because that's where we want it. What's left over after filtration and reabsorption of good stuff is tinkle, is urine. With each organ system, I am asking students to do a little bit of research on disease or malfunction of that organ system. Here's one for you: the kidney stones. If you've ever made rock candy, you might know something about kidney stones. So rock candy, you take sugar water, you let the water evaporate, and as the sugar concentrates, it starts to crystallize. Similar process is happening in your kidneys. As we concentrate some of these compounds within your kidneys, they can start to crystallize. The crystals, if they're big enough, can actually block the ureter, and you block the flow of urine from the kidney to the urinary bladder. In that case, you're going to have to get that stone out of there. Quite often, we try to pass the stone, so then that crystal has to go through the ureter, through the urinary bladder, out the urethra. Now, that scanning electron micrograph is of a surface of a kidney stone, so if it looks like a whole bunch of broken glass, that's what needs to pass out of the urethra. Not something you really want to deal with. Plus, they can get pretty big. Here's one that's about 1 centimeter across. Now, not all kidney stones are passed. Some of them can be kind of broken apart using sound waves. You still have to pass the little bits. If this sounds like something you don't want, a lot of it is genetic. So I clearly have the genes. My dad and my older brother both have suffered from kidney stones. The other thing is you want to avoid foods that are high in oxalates, like spinach, rhubarb, beets, all this stuff that I have on the list. Of course, for me, strawberry rhubarb pie is one of my favoriteest desserts in the world. So there you go. Well, I think that's enough for now. If you have any other questions, please, please, please shoot me an email. Leave it in the comments section here if you're watching on YouTube. Track me down somehow. Now, given what's going on, I would love to say I'll see you in class. But for now, I'll just say wash your hands and stop touching your face.